Close your eyes and picture Charleston, South Carolina. You are probably imagining cobblestone streets, horse-drawn carriages, towering pastel mansions, and polite society sipping sweet tea on a sprawling veranda. Now, open your eyes, because every single piece of that romanticized illusion is a lie. The year is 1670. You are standing knee-deep in foul-smelling pluff mud on a humid, mosquito-infested bluff called Albemarle Point. There are no grand mansions. There is no polite society. There are only 150 desperate, terrified people clinging to the edge of an untamed, hostile wilderness, completely surrounded by towering empires who want nothing more than to wipe them off the map. This isn't a city of leisure. It is a raw, brutal, and highly vulnerable survival camp. It is a muddy trench where every single day is a grueling coin flip against starvation, tropical disease, and indigenous attacks. So, how did this miserable, disease-ridden swamp transform into the wealthiest, most influential, and arguably the darkest economic empire in early North America? To find the answer, we have to strip away the polite historical myths. We are going back to the absolute beginning. And along the way, we are going to uncover secrets that completely rewrite American history, including the shocking truth about America's very first cowboys, who were not riding the dusty plains of Texas but fighting off alligators right here in the Carolina swamps. Take a deep breath of the heavy, rotting air. Let's step back over 3.5 centuries. Welcome to the nightmare. Dawn breaks, but there is no relief. You open your eyes, not in a 4-poster mahogany bed beneath a lazily turning ceiling fan, but on a hard, damp dirt floor inside a crude wattle and daub hut. Instantly, you feel it, the sheer, crushing weight of the air. It is a suffocating, subtropical humidity that feels exactly like a hot, wet blanket pressed firmly against your chest. It is only the beginning of summer, yet the heat is already unbearable before the sun has even managed to breach the dense, ancient tree line. The relentless, high-pitched whine of mosquitoes fills the dark, cramped room. You dress in the dim, murky light. Forget the crisp, white linen suits and hoop skirts you've seen in the Hollywood movies. You put on heavy, tightly woven English wool. Layers of it. Because you are an English colonist, and English colonists wear proper civilized English clothes, even when they have been violently thrust into a boiling, hostile southern swamp. The sweat begins almost immediately. It clings to your skin, trapping the heat, making your heavy woolen garments feel like a suffocating suit of armor. You look around your tiny, claustrophobic dwelling. The roof above you is haphazardly thatched with palmetto fronds. The walls are essentially just sticks packed with mud and clay. There are no grand, sweeping piazzas here. There is no polite society sipping tea on the veranda. This is a survival camp. Just making it to sunset is a genuine physical accomplishment. Every single action you take today will be dictated by a desperate, exhausting fight against the elements. You step outside into the blinding morning glare, and the horrifying reality of your situation finally sets in. You are standing inside a hastily constructed wooden palisade. It is a crude wall built out of sheer, unadulterated terror. Beyond those jagged wooden spikes lies an endless, impenetrable forest, teeming with unknown threats. You can feel the profound isolation pressing in on you from all sides. You have been dumped onto a muddy, unforgiving peninsula at the edge of the known world, and the environment itself is actively trying to swallow you whole. As you walk through the muddy, stench-filled encampment, trying to ignore the gnawing hunger in your stomach, you take a good look at the people around you. It is a strange, highly volatile mix of humanity. You see pale, severely malnourished English colonists who look completely out of place in this tropical furnace, their skin blistering under the unforgiving sun. You see desperate indentured servants, men and women who signed away years of their lives just to escape the crushing poverty and disease of London, only to find themselves traded for a much faster, much more brutal kind of misery. But then, you see a very different group. Men who walk with a hardened, arrogant confidence, completely unfazed by the suffocating heat or the squalor. These are the Barbadians, and this brings us to the dark, brutal secret at the very core of Charlestown's creation. A secret that sets it apart from almost every other English settlement in North America. Most history books will comfortably tell you that slavery was an institution that slowly, gradually crept into the American colonies over several decades. They paint a picture of a gradual moral decline, a system that evolved out of economic convenience. But not here. Carolina is completely, fundamentally different. This colony was deliberately, meticulously designed to be a ruthless slave society from the absolute beginning. The wealthy Barbadian planters did not just bring their massive, insatiable ambitions to this muddy bluff. They brought their enslaved workers with them on the very first ships. And here is the profound irony. These enslaved West Africans were the true survivors. While the English colonists were dropping dead from heat stroke, entirely clueless about the landscape, the Africans were the ones who actually knew how to survive in this brutal environment. They understood the oppressive subtropical heat. They knew how to navigate the treacherous, alligator-infested swamps without getting lost or killed. They knew exactly how to carve massive, sturdy dugout canoes from giant cypress trees. And most importantly, they possessed the vital, intricate agricultural knowledge that would keep this struggling, pathetic little settlement from starving to death in its first few months. The Barbadians brought a ruthlessly efficient blueprint for immense wealth, and they immediately locked it into the very DNA of the colony. The English crown provided the royal charter and the grand titles, but Barbados provided the muscle, the method, and the staggering cruelty. In Charlestown, human beings were not just laborers. They were the absolute, unquestionable foundation of the economy, imported alongside the very first wooden beams used to build the palisade. Yet, despite this sudden, massive influx of hardened Caribbean veterans and their enslaved laborers, the tiny settlement of Charlestown is still barely clinging to life, because they are not alone, and the men staring out from the jagged gaps in the wooden palisade are constantly keeping their heavy muskets primed and loaded. They know a terrifying truth. They are sitting directly in the crosshairs of the greatest military superpower on Earth. To the south lies the massive, heavily fortified Spanish stronghold of St. Augustine. For nearly a century, the Spanish crown has considered this entire stretch of coastline their sovereign territory. They view the English as illegal, diseased squatters, a pestilence that needs to be completely eradicated, and they absolutely have the military might to do it. The Spanish garrison is massive, well-trained, and utterly ruthless. To make matters even worse, French privateers routinely prowl the coastline, looking for easy, vulnerable targets to plunder and burn. This terrifying, constant reality explains the bizarre, claustrophobic layout of 1670 Charlestown. If you visit modern Charleston today, you will find it perched elegantly on a beautiful, breezy peninsula overlooking the open ocean. But this first settlement is not on that famous peninsula. It is miles inland, hidden far up the winding, marshy Ashley River. They are hiding. They chose this miserable, swampy location because it is easily defensible. The tidal river protects them on one side, and a deep, impassable, muddy creek protects them on the other. The entire town is essentially a military trench. There are no grand, sweeping avenues. The streets are narrow, muddy, deeply rutted paths designed purely to move soldiers and heavy ammunition quickly from one defensive point to another. The air inside the palisade is thick with a paralyzing, collective paranoia. The iron cannons pointing down the river are not for show. They are primed, loaded, and manned day and night. Every single time a white sail appears on the distant horizon, the entire settlement holds its collective breath. The silence is deafening as they wait to see if it is a desperately needed supply ship from England or the vanguard of the Spanish Armada coming to slaughter every man, woman, and child. The psychological toll of living in this constant, suffocating state of impending doom is unimaginable. But despite the paralyzing fear, despite the oppressive heat, the squalor, and the disease, these people are determined to turn a profit. They are not here for religious freedom or high-minded ideals. They are here for money. And on this brutal frontier, they will do absolutely whatever it takes to get it. So, how do you actually generate wealth in a place like this? If you are imagining vast, sweeping plantations of Carolina gold rice or endless fields of white cotton, you are a century too early. In 1670, there are no grand cash crops. This is a gritty, grueling frontier economy, and it is built entirely on sheer physical exhaustion. The men here spend their days chest-deep in the stagnant swamps, hacking down massive cedar trees and violently scraping pine trunks to extract sticky, highly flammable pitch and tar. These naval stores are desperately needed by the English Navy to waterproof their wooden ships back home. It is backbreaking, miserable labor. But there is another major industry here, one that completely destroys everything you thought you knew about American history. Long before the dusty plains of Texas, long before the classic Hollywood westerns, Charlestown was home to America's very first cowboys. But they did not wear 10-gallon hats, and they were not riding the open western range. They were enslaved West Africans. Using their highly specialized generational knowledge of animal husbandry, these men were forced to herd massive, unruly populations of free-range cattle through the dense, alligator-infested Carolina swamps. These black cowboys were absolutely essential to the colony's survival. They drove the cattle from the deep woods to the coast so the beef could be slaughtered, heavily salted, packed into wooden barrels and shipped off. Shipped where? To feed the massive, starving slave populations on the sugar plantations in the Caribbean. It was a highly dangerous, isolating existence. Armed with long whips and navigating the treacherous terrain, these early American cowboys faced the constant threat of predators, both animal and human. Yet their unparalleled skills created the very first lucrative export of the Carolina colony. The cruelty of the system was completely circular. Charlestown was quite literally feeding the beast of the Atlantic slave trade, cementing a brutal economic model that would only grow more ruthless with time. And when the brutal Carolina sun beats down, and the legitimate backbreaking trade inevitably slows, another, far more dangerous type of commerce takes over the murky waters of the Ashley River. Charlestown is, for all intents and purposes, the Wild West of the eastern seaboard. Because the English colonists are so profoundly terrified of the Spanish fleet anchored just down the coast, the local colonial governor makes a desperate, highly illegal decision. He deliberately turns a blind eye to the ruthless, bloodthirsty men operating just off the coastline. Privateers, heavily armed, state-sponsored pirates. These violent sea raiders, men who make their living boarding and plundering heavily defended Spanish galleons in the Caribbean, are quietly welcomed into the muddy, dimly lit taverns of Charlestown. It is a marriage of pure, unadulterated convenience. The pirates act as an unofficial, heavily armed mercenary navy. They provide a terrifying but absolutely necessary buffer between the fragile, disease-ridden settlement and the wrath of the Spanish Armada. In return for a safe harbor to repair their battered ships and restock their provisions, these outlaws flood the local, historically cash-starved economy with plundered Spanish silver. They buy up vast quantities of locally produced naval stores, salted beef from the black cowboys, and most importantly, the absolute silence and complicity of the local authorities. Imagine the scene. A supposed English gentleman, the founders of a great American city, sitting shoulder to shoulder in a sweltering, mud-floored pub, clinking glasses with wanted murderers and thieves. It is a brilliant, completely lawless arrangement. A desperate pact made with the devil that keeps the struggling town afloat when all other legitimate options fail. The men who founded this city were not righteous, God-fearing pioneers looking for religious freedom. They were ruthless opportunists, perfectly willing to harbor the most dangerous criminals on the high seas just to survive another year in the swamp. Midday approaches, and the brutal labor temporarily halts for a meal. Now, if you are imagining a classic, luxurious spread of modern Charleston low-country cuisine, succulent shrimp and grits, freshly roasted oysters, or warm, flaky biscuits, erase that from your mind entirely. The reality of your diet in 1670 is a miserable, monotonous gamble with severe food poisoning. Your daily ration consists of dried peas, rock-hard Indian corn, and heavily salted beef. But this meat wasn't freshly butchered. It was packed into wooden barrels months ago in England, shipped across the churning Atlantic Ocean, and left to bake in the relentless Carolina sun. When you finally pry open the barrel, the overpowering smell of rotting, rancid meat hits you like a physical blow. But you scrape off the worst of the mold and eat it anyway, because you are starving, and there is absolutely nothing else. You choke down the spoiled beef, and now you are desperately thirsty. The oppressive heat is draining the moisture directly out of your pores. But you cannot drink the water. The local water supply, drawn from shallow, muddy wells, is a toxic, brackish soup teeming with deadly bacteria. Taking a long drink of untreated water here is practically a guaranteed death sentence. So, what do you drink to survive the boiling summers? The answer is alcohol, specifically rum. Rum, shipped up from the massive, brutal sugar plantations of the West Indies, is the absolute lifeblood of Charlestown. It is the everyday beverage for everyone. Men, women, and even young children drink watered-down rum all day just to stay hydrated without contracting severe dysentery. But it is much more than just a survival drink. It is the literal liquid currency of the colony. Silver coin is extremely rare on this frontier, so you pay your debts, buy your supplies, and trade using rum. It fuels the exhausted laborers, pacifies the dangerous privateers, and numbs the constant gnawing fear of a Spanish attack. You sit in the dirt, washing down rancid beef with warm, harsh rum, wondering how long your body can actually endure this. I have to ask you right now, could you survive a week on these 17th century frontier rations? Let me know down in the comments, because honestly, I do not think I would last 2 days. And how does this chaotic, disease-ridden frontier town actually govern itself? The answer is one of the most bizarre and contradictory chapters in early American history. While the desperate men in the swamps are fighting off alligators, battling malaria, and trying not to starve on rotting beef, the aristocratic lords proprietors back in the safety of England, the wealthy men who actually own the colony, have completely different ideas. They view Carolina not as a desperate, muddy survival camp, but as a blank canvas for a grand utopian social experiment. To create this flawless utopia, they hire a man who will later become one of the most famous and influential philosophers in Western history, John Locke. Locke sits in his comfortable study and co-authors a massive, wildly complicated document called the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina. It is, to put it mildly, a philosopher's fever dream. The document attempts to force a rigid, medieval-style feudal system onto this mosquito-ridden mud pit thousands of miles away. It creates an absurd new social hierarchy, granting elite, made-up titles like landgraves and caciques to the wealthiest landowners, while completely subjugating the poorer colonists, who are literally referred to as leet men or serfs. It is completely and utterly disconnected from reality. You have men dying of yellow fever while dressed in filthy rags, essentially being told they are part of a grand orderly European feudal estate. But the Fundamental Constitutions is also incredibly revealing about the true nature of Charlestown. Contrast this place with Puritan Boston, which was founded just a few decades earlier. Boston is a strict, hyper-religious theocracy where church and state are essentially identical. Charlestown is the exact opposite. It is a ruthless, profit-driven corporate venture. Surprisingly, the Fundamental Constitutions actually guarantees a shocking amount of religious freedom for the era. But make no mistake, this was not born out of a sense of modern moral enlightenment. It was pure, unadulterated greed. The Lord's proprietors desperately needed warm bodies to settle the land and generate profit. They did not care if you were an Anglican, a persecuted French Huguenot, a dissenter, or Jewish. As long as you could work the swamps, fight off the Spanish, and generate wealth, you were welcome to pray to whoever you wanted. So, you have this incredibly strange dynamic. A high-minded, philosophical blueprint layered over a brutal survival of the fittest reality. It is a society built entirely on grand illusions and dark, muddy truths. And the tension between the two is already threatening to tear the young colony apart. But how did 150 starving, terrified colonists actually survive being completely surrounded by the Spanish Empire? The answer has almost nothing to do with English military brilliance. They survived because they were incredibly lucky, and because they formed a vital, strategic alliance with the local indigenous people, the Kiawah. The Kiawah actually invited the English to settle here initially. They saw these heavily armed newcomers not as masters, but as a highly useful, tactical buffer against their own regional enemies. And navigating this incredibly complex, dangerous web of native alliances fell to one of the most fascinating and mysterious figures in American history, Dr. Henry Woodward. Woodward was not a typical colonial aristocrat or a hardened Barbadian planter. He was a brilliant, highly eccentric linguist and diplomat who voluntarily left the safety of the English camps to live deep in the wilderness among the native tribes for years. He immersed himself completely in their culture, learning their complex languages, adopting their customs, and quietly forging a massive, lucrative trade network that spanned the entire Southeast. Through Woodward's deep connections, Charlestown discovered a completely new source of immense wealth: the deerskin trade. The European demand for high-quality leather was absolutely insatiable at the time, and soon thousands upon thousands of pelts were flowing out of the Carolina forests. This trade transformed the struggling outpost into a booming, highly profitable commercial trading hub for the English crown. But this sudden explosion of wealth came with a horrifying, dark turn. The trade network Woodward meticulously built quickly evolved into something much more sinister. The colonists realized they could trade not just for animal skins, but for human captives. They began actively encouraging local native tribes to raid their rivals and trade the prisoners of war to the English. This ignited a highly vicious, continent-wide Indian slave trade that would fundamentally destabilize the entire region for generations. While the deerskin and slave trades made the merchants of Charlestown unbelievably rich almost overnight, they were simultaneously lighting a very long, dangerous fuse. They were actively planting the seeds for devastating, catastrophic conflicts that would eventually push the entire colony to the absolute brink of total annihilation in the years to come. The sun dips below the tree line, but the heat remains thick and stagnant. As shadows stretch across the muddy trenches of Charlestown, the true rulers of this fragile colony emerge from the dark, rotting swamps. A low, terrifying hum rises from the marshes. Mosquitoes swarm in suffocating clouds, pouring through the oiled paper windows of the crude huts. You swat at your neck, unaware these tiny insects are carrying a silent death sentence. In 1670, the world believes in miasmas, foul air from decaying grass. You burn pungent pine pitch, choking on black smoke, desperately trying to purify the invisible toxins. It does nothing. The slaughter has begun. Malaria brings burning, delirious fevers. But it is yellow fever that truly stalks these paths, turning victims a sickly, pale yellow before they succumb to an agonizing death. Half of the children born here will not see their 20th birthday. Moving to Carolina was a deadly gamble, and for many it was a fatal mistake. Yet, from this misery, a terrifying empire was born. The survivors solidified a system of brutal exploitation that would spark the bloodiest conflict in American history. In 10 years, they will pack what's left and move downriver to Oyster Point. That is where the real Charleston begins. Thanks for stepping into the past with Chronicles of Time. If you survived this journey, hit subscribe. What city should we reconstruct next? Let us know in the comments. See you in the past.